but do better in your jokes. So with that, So I want folks to think about moments where they've been a part of this problem of sexism in our communities. Again, whether you were a victim, whether you were a bystander, whether you may have had a hand in it with or without realizing it, and the way that it permeates through our community and it affects the way people grow as Muslims and as leaders, as students, as brothers and sisters and sons and daughters and everything else that we identify as. So I'm going to hand off or start the conversation with the rest of our esteemed guests by introducing them, inshallah. Starting with, from my right, Sunnah, we have with us Ustadha Maryam Amir Ibrahimi. So briefly, Ustadha Maryam Amir Ibrahimi has a strong background in leadership and is a passionate advocate for social justice. In high school, she acted as the Associated Student Body President and was personally recognized as Student of the Year by former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. In college at San Jose State University, she served 2 consecutive terms as the MSA President. Upon graduating with a BA in Child and Adolescent Development, Maryam partook in an 11-month study abroad program in Cairo, Egypt, where she studied the Holy Quran and learned and became fluent in classical Arabic. Upon returning from Cairo, she entered the field of education, earning her teaching credential and master's in urban education from the University of California, Los Angeles. Currently, Maryam is pursuing a second bachelor's degree in Islamic studies. Maryam speaks regularly in conferences and events, holds a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, and speaks 4 languages. Y'all know, no messing with her. It will come back for you. Continuing to the right, we have with us Sister Dalia Mogahed. Dalia Mogahed is an American scholar of Egyptian origin. She received her undergraduate degree in chemical engineering with a minor in Arabic from the University of Wisconsin. She subsequently received her MBA from the Joseph M. Katz Graduate School of Business at the University of Pittsburgh. She is the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, IPSU for short, ISPU for short, in Washington, D.C. She is also President and CEO of Mogahed Consulting, a Washington, D.C.-based executive coaching and consulting firm, specializing in Muslim societies and the Middle East. Mogahed is a former executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, a nonpartisan research center that provides data and analysis to reflect the views of Muslims all over the world. She was selected as an advisor by U.S. President Barack Obama on the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And last but not least, Chef Jamal Diwan was born and raised in Southern California. He received a bachelor's degree in Third World Studies from UCSD in 2005. He then traveled to Egypt with his wife, Sheikha Musnava Permal, where they spent the next 6 years studying Arabic and Islamic studies. In 2012, he completed a law degree in Sharia from Al-Azhar University in Cairo. While in Egypt, he also nearly finished an MA in Islamic studies at the American University of Cairo. He is a regular speaker at universities and Islamic centers on issues pertaining to Islam and the Muslims in America. In 2014, OC Weekly chose him from among Orange County's most fascinating people, and the OC Register chose him from the top 100 most influential people in Orange County. He served as the resident scholar of the Islamic Center of Irvine for 2.5 years. Currently, he serves the Muslim communities at UCLA, USC, and UCI as a chaplain through the Institute of Knowledge, and is the co-founder and director of Safa Center for Research. I'm going to stop talking so we can continue from our scholars, inshallah. I want to pose a question to the ladies on stage. How do you understand your role as a Muslim woman within Muslim community and in greater society? I I understand my role as a Muslim woman the way that Safiya radiallahu anha, the aunt of the Prophet ﷺ, understood her role when she was in an area during the battle of the trench where women were staying, and Hassan ibn Thabit, who was the poet of the Prophet ﷺ, was staying with the woman because may Allah bless him in every way. He wasn't a person who stood physically on the front lines of battle. He was a soldier with his words. And when there was somebody scaling the place that they were staying, that the women were staying from the enemy line, Safiya saw it, and she knew that this could be someone that killed women in that area. And so she told Hassan radiallahu anhu, she told him, hey, there's like a guy, he's coming up. And this is like, a big translation and summary of the situation. And Hassan was like, if I could handle that, I would have been in the battle. So Safiya radiallahu anha, she went and she took care. She, physically took care of the person who was the enemy. And she didn't stop for a moment to think, I'm a woman and I can't protect the other woman. Hassan radiallahu anhu didn't stop and say, you're a woman, you can't take care of the other woman. The way that I understand being a Muslim woman in our community and general society is the way that Salama radiallahu anha, when they were in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and the Prophet ﷺ, his companions were so overwhelmed with sadness that they didn't feel like they had won in that situation. And so they weren't following the Prophet ﷺ, and he went to Allah ﷺ, he was frustrated. He went to his wife Salama, and he asked her what to do. He told her the situation, and she gave him advice. She gave advice to him, and she told him to go ahead and do the actions, and the people will follow. May Allah bless them all. But in that moment, Salama didn't think, I'm a woman and I can't give advice to my beloved husband, the most incredible man on earth, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And in that moment, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam didn't think, she's a woman, she's my wife, I can't take advice from her. I take my example of being a Muslim woman in the Muslim community and in society from people like Khansa bin Amr, who was a poet in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, who the poet praised. I take from Nasiba, who stood and who physically defended the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, so much so that he said that he saw her to the right and to the left everywhere he looked. From Rufayd al-Islamiyya, she was a surgeon in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and she took care of the surgery of one of the top companions of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam when he got hurt during battle, because the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam asked her to take care of him because she was a boss. I take my understanding of being a Muslim woman from the Sahabiyat, who stood with the Prophet ﷺ, and the Sahaba who stood with the Prophet ﷺ, because their understanding of what it means to be a Muslim woman wasn't relegated to gender specifically. It wasn't, you can't do that because you're a woman. It was, we appreciate you because you're a woman. And the skills that you have, whether it's in using your voice, whether it's in being a mom, whether it's in being in surgery, whether it's leading, whether it's staying at home, whatever you feel is calling to you within the guidelines of Islam, that your number one role isn't specifically tied to marriage. It isn't specifically tied to motherhood. It's tied to being the slave of God. And everything else that comes with that, every other aspect of your identity that comes with that, those are acts of worship to God. So, if I want to make my number one role be a mom, may Allah bless me and may Allah bless anybody who chooses that, then that's going to be my servitude to God. If I'm going to make it so that I'm going to be the best teacher that the world has ever seen, then inshallah that's going to be my servitude to God. But I understand my role as a Muslim woman to be the slave of God, number one, and after that, however I can use my life in a way that He would be pleased with, based on the incredible dynamic and quiet, the outgoing and the shy, the every single type of woman we see at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and all of the men who didn't stop them from being women, but who appreciated them for who they were, and who encouraged them, and who allied with them to be the best that they could be.
Okay, I'll try to speak out so I can build on that. As I thought about this question, I wanted to reflect on a verse from the Quran that I think really guides me in this topic. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتُ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. That the believing men and the believing women are guardians of one another. awliya ba'd. And when you think about the word wali, it's a guardian, meaning someone who protects the other, someone who stands up for the rights of the other. And this is actually the Quranic relationship that men and women should have. This is how Allah has prescribed for us to relate to one another. This relationship of mutual support, of having each other's back, of standing up for each other's rights. It's such a beautiful, symmetric relationship. And what I really find interesting about this specific ayah is the context. This is actually in Surah At-Tawbah. Surah At-Tawbah is a surah that talks about jihad. It talks about the Muslim community being in a very precarious situation, a Muslim community that is under threat. And yet it is in this surah, within this context, that this description of the relationship between men and women is given. And I think that's very significant, because oftentimes the idea that women or other groups would sort of say, you know, we don't think we're being treated right by the community, and the response to that is, you know, how dare you even bring this up when there's so much for us to deal with, when there's so much attack from without. And very significant that this prescription for how we relate to each other is embedded, is at the heart of a surah that is talking about a community that is under threat, that has to defend itself from all corners. And I think this is so significant because it actually gives us a window into how to fortify our community when we are under threat. If we are fractured within, if we are not respecting the rights of the most vulnerable within our community, we are never going to be able to withstand the attacks from outside. And I think this is really at the heart of it. The idea that because there's Islamophobia, we can't talk about inter-Muslim issues is actually a false dichotomy. It's built on a false premise. It is precisely because the Muslim community is so under attack that we have to get our own house in order. And I think that this simple but beautiful ayah gives us so much in the way of guidance. You know, it goes on to say, describing these believing men and the believing women, first as awliya to each other, standing up for each other's rights, representing each other in the way that the other would want. And it's not men are the guardians of women, but that women are the guardians of men. They are guardians of one another. And they enjoin what is right and forbid what is evil. They are working for a better society together. There's this cooperative spirit that is imbued in this ayah, telling us, you know, something like an MSA is a perfect vehicle to manifest and to live out the values that are communicated in this ayah. It's not a relationship of hierarchy, but a relationship of mutual respect. So when I think about my own role as a woman, this is the ayah that really animates my perspective when I am working on behalf of the community. I see my male counterparts as people that I expect to have my back and that ones that I will support. And I completely agree with Maryam when she says that I really do think of myself first as a servant of God. And I think this is incredibly important because there's so much pressure on women, especially, that they are valued and described in relationship to other people. They are a wife, they are a mother, they are a daughter. While men, in many cases, are described in their value is in terms of their own individual accomplishments, not just as a father or husband, but as, you know, as a professor, as a community activist. And I think this difference in how we value someone as a human being is actually in complete contradiction to the Quranic vision of awliya ba'd, the protectors of one another, both working for the betterment of society.
Jazakallah khair. I then want to ask, this question is posed to all three of you, but I'd like the women to answer first. I'd like to ask, what are the challenges that you may face in your work and in the Muslim community in relation to sexism?
Again. First thing I want to start out by emphasizing is that sexism is not a monopoly of the Muslim community. It is not something that only the Muslim community is dealing with. So I do want to start off by saying that sexism is literally everywhere. I've worked in corporate America, and sexism is all over corporate America. When you look at statistics around violence against women, sexual assault, in our country, the #1 perpetrator of murder of women is someone who's been an intimate partner. So the idea that sexism is just a human problem is something that I think we have to start with. And I hope that realization helps to perhaps take down some of the feelings of maybe defensiveness when we talk about this issue. It is not a Muslim problem, it is a human problem. And so what are some of the challenges that we face in our community as human beings? I started to talk about, one is this idea that women are valued in how they relate to others rather than how they stand as human beings. And I think that that's really the foundation of where a lot of other problems come forth. The second is that there is a false connection that we are making between piety and the exclusion of women. And where mosques are sort of viewed by some people as like a men's private club, rather than a place of building community, where everyone has to feel included. At ISPU, the organization that I direct research for, we just did a major study on mosques and how to make them more inclusive, especially for women, converts, and young people. And when we did focus groups specifically on the issue of women, what we found is that what women wanted was actually just their most basic rights that they were actually denied. They wanted access to the Imam. They wanted equal access to educational opportunities. They wanted to just simply be included in the normal life of a masjid. They wanted a role in decision making. Everything that people were saying they were denied and was causing their alienation were things that were actually completely guaranteed to women ever since the dawn of Islam, as Maryam explained. So I guess, just to be very brief, sexism is not a Muslim problem, it's a human problem. And the manifestations of sexism in our community really have to be dealt with because they are in contradiction to our faith.
Building on what our amazing Ustad Dalia, you mentioned Ustad Dalia, I feel like there's a lot of sexism within the structure of our community. Wanting these things is a byproduct of the way that we have structured our masajid and the way that we structure our Muslim spaces. So, when we as women feel like it's normal to walk into a masjid and not be able to ask questions of the Imam, that is an issue of sexism. When we feel like if you're a mother and you want to pray in the mother's lounge, or you're a father and you don't have a space for fathers to pray in because there's no father's lounge, that is an issue of sexism. Spaces where, growing up, when I heard a woman give me advice, I didn't take it seriously because she wasn't a man. So if it was a sheikh giving me advice, then he's a sheikh. But a sheikha, well, they're not as knowledgeable as men simply because of your gender. Feeling like, when I go to the masjid and I don't know what rak'ah they're on. I'm hearing Allahu Akbar, but I can't see the men praying. So where am I supposed to pray? Ladies, has this ever happened to you? You're like, what rak'ah are they even on? Oh, actually, they were on ruku'ah. Yeah, I was in sujood. So all of these spaces where we go to conferences and the people who have privilege and power have mics and they're on stage and they're men, but then we have a female moderator because we want to be able to balance the scales by having a woman on stage. A female moderator is not the same thing as providing women with consistent spaces to be able to speak to the issues in our community. Also, when we look at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there's this concept that women are not encouraged to go to the masjid. Have you ever heard the saying of Aisha radiallahu anha, where she says, if the Prophet ﷺ saw the way that women were today, he would have prohibited them from going to the masjid. Raise your hand if you've heard that statement before. So that statement has frequently been used to say, okay, that's the time of Aisha radiallahu anha, but imagine today. Of course women dress better than they do today. Ibn Hajar radiallahu anha, you know what he says about that? He says that Aisha radiallahu anha saw the way that women had access to so many things today. How we had access and we feel like it's okay for us to go to the mall, we go to the movies, we go to school, we go everywhere, but then we feel guilty when we walk into the masjid because we're not sure if we belong there. If Aisha radiallahu anha saw that, then she wouldn't have said that women don't belong in the masjid, that the Prophet ﷺ would have prohibited them. She would have said women are obligated to go to the masjid. Because we need spaces where we feel like we can connect with our So the point is that when it's so ingrained in us, that it's normal for us not to be able to know what rak'ah they're on, for us not to feel like we can connect with people. When we have male speakers, may Allah bless them, and even female speakers, because women can be the biggest inheritors of patriarchy. When we are standing in spaces and we hear, Umar radiallahu anhu was so strong and powerful, Khalid radiallahu anhu, he led a battle, Bilal radiallahu anhu, he had the most amazing adhan. And then when any one of us as women try to emulate one of their personalities, because that's just how we are, we're told that's immodest. That's not haya. You're not practicing Islam properly, because if you really want to be pious, then you shouldn't raise your voice. You shouldn't be assertive. But the examples we're given are all male examples constantly, or frequently. Not always, but very frequently. So how do we balance what it's supposed to mean to actually be a Muslim woman when we're not even given examples by people of our gender in how we're supposed to interact? Sheikh Muslima, may Allah bless her, is someone who's incredible, who you can access in the Muslim community in SoCal. But like growing up, Sheikh Muslima was one of my role models once I met her. But beyond her, there was nobody for me when I grew up. I tried to be pious by looking at how men were pious. And realistically, we have different expectations when it comes to Muslim women, so that becomes very, very difficult in the Muslim community. So, I'm just done. Thank you.
Sheikh, I did pose the question to you, but I also know that you're a man of few words. Would you like to add to the question? So the question, to repeat it, what are challenges that you may face in your work and in the Muslim community in relation to sexism?
See, there you go, perfect.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. Bismillah. So, for those of you who know us, we kind of, you could say we have an old dog in this fight. My wife was speaking at MSA West and many other places before that was a common thing for women to do, and also coming from a community that tends to be a little bit more conservative on a number of issues than, for example, the Orange County or Los Angeles community. And we definitely faced a number of difficulties with that. But how do I, particularly in my work, deal with it? To me, I think it's important that we frame everything from the perspective of Islam. And that's always my starting point. And that was my starting point from the very beginning of me having to deal with these issues after we got married. Because people would come to me and they say, well, don't you have a problem with your wife speaking in front of men, and don't you think this or that? There was a time when a sheikh wrote a letter and then he asked my wife, who's your teacher? He wrote the letter for her and he gave it to her. They spoke on a panel together. He gave her the letter and then we took it back to San Diego, and it was written in Arabic. We didn't speak Arabic at that time. So we gave it to one of the sheikhs and he's like, oh, okay, you know. Then we showed it to Sheikh Taha actually, you know, who was here yesterday. And Sheikh Taha had some very choice words to say about it. Basically the letter said, this woman is too young to be speaking in front of mixed audiences. And so alhamdulillah, we've had, I think for us, we've been very blessed in the sense that there's been struggles, but we've been part of institutions that have supported us in that path. So initially it was Sheikh Taha in San Diego was a big proponent of being able to have that space. Mass very often gave Muslims space to do that. And then alhamdulillah, when we were able to study in Egypt, that was a good opportunity. When we came back and I worked in the masjid under a president who was a woman. The president of the masjid was a woman. We had prayer space downstairs in our masjid for women. We had women, especially elderly women, pray downstairs in Ramadan even. We made a little spot for them, right there in the musalla in front of, like right next to the men with a little bit of a barrier because that's all we could do. And I thought people would have a problem with it. They didn't have a problem with it, alhamdulillah. And then now we're in the MSAs. And for MSAs, this tends to be less of an issue than other places. But, you know, we want to build communities that are healthy. And we want to support people in their expression of Islam in a way that will be beneficial to the entire community. I mean, look around the room. It's about 2 to 1, right? For male to female. So I think that one of our challenges moving forward in dealing with the issue of sexism, for me on a personal level and dealing a lot with college students, I think our problem is actually going to be, what is that healthy understanding going to look like? Because the reality of it is, it's 2 to 1. And it's been 2 to 1 for a while, and so the culture of the community is shifting. And 10, 15 years from now, you're not going to have the same perspectives that you had 10, 15 years ago. But the question is it still going to be something that's acceptable in Islam? So we had maybe perspectives that took too narrow of a look at it, but we don't want to eliminate the whole body of guidance either. And so this is one of, just on a personal level, one of the questions that we struggle with, but alhamdulillah, we just do our best.
All right, so we have talked about our placement and our role in society. We've named some of the problems and some of the challenges that face us in our work. To the women, how do you navigate male allyship? And for folks who aren't hip with the social justice lingo, allyship is essentially dedicating yourself to being a partner in the interests of someone who identifies differently than you do. It can be an allyship on the grounds of gender, it can be an allyship on the grounds of race, it can be an allyship on the grounds of socioeconomic class. But that's essentially what we're looking at here, is really dedicating yourself to helping another community in improving their status. So to the women, how do you navigate male allyship in alleviating the effects of sexism? And what are practical tools that we can take back to our community in general to combat it?
The first step I would take is looking at personal responsibility. These are some of my favorite narrations ever that I'm going to share with you, which you might have heard from me a million times. Al-Fadl radiallahu anhu, he was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ. He was sitting with the Prophet ﷺ on a riding animal when a beautiful woman came up to them to ask a question. And there have been so many times in my personal life where I have been told that I am a fitna. That means a temptation. When I've been told that as a woman I shouldn't be in this space asking questions and I should find my dad, my brother, anyone else who can ask that question on my behalf. There have been times where someone has made a general statement when myself and a group of sisters walk into a halaqah of knowledge and they said, oh, here comes the fitna. These messages are frequently the ones that I internalized as I try to navigate what it means to be a practicing, I didn't use to be practicing, but someone who conscientiously is Muslim in our society today. And hearing those things was very psychologically damaging to me because I went from somebody who thought that my relationship with Allah is based on my actions to somebody who carried the weight of if a man has a sinful thought about me, I don't want to use the word sinful, that's not right, but has a thought about me that's not necessarily appropriate, then I'm the carrier of that guilt. I went from somebody who felt like I was empowered to ask questions and to study, from somebody who was terrified that in some way my presence could cause somebody who's conscientious of God to stop thinking about God. And that is not the message that the Prophet ﷺ has taught us. When this beautiful woman came up to the Prophet ﷺ to ask a question in the time of Hajj, Al-Fadl started checking her out, may Allah bless him. She was beautiful and he started looking at her. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell her, go back and ask a male to come and ask your question. He didn't tell her, cover your face so that Al-Fadl isn't attracted by your beauty. He didn't blame her at all for being beautiful. He turned Al-Fadl's face away. He taught him how to have personal responsibility in having interactions with women, even if he was attracted to them. And that teaches us that as a community, we need to teach personal responsibility for men and for women. That it is my space to ask a question, whether or not someone else might be uncomfortable with that. And it is my space as a male ally to provide spaces for women where they won't feel uncomfortable asking a question, where they won't feel like they're being checked out, where they won't feel like the space isn't theirs as well. In that one interaction, the Prophet ﷺ taught us that. We all have personal responsibility in dress and lowering our gaze. There are guidelines that Allah SWT has given us for how we can interact as allies. Allies are people who get your back. They're not people you're terrified of. They're not people who assault you. They're not people who hurt you in some way. They have your back because they're your brothers. And they have your back because they're your sisters. And the Prophet ﷺ teaches us personal responsibility in that matter. The second thing is that fear doesn't create policy. In our community, we are so terrified of gender relations going wrong that we segregate and isolate instead of teach how to professionally interact. And in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Shaykh al-Muslima taught me this beautiful narration of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, who narrates that there was a beautiful woman who stood in the back of the Prophet ﷺ's masjid, and a group of young men, of Sahaba who would walk into the masjid. And in the Prophet ﷺ's masjid, there was no barrier. So they would go into the masjid and she's in the front row and they would pray in the background. In Salah, they would look under and check her out. May Allah bless them and forgive them. And they're the companions, they're the greatest ever. And yet, subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ didn't enforce a policy that now this woman shouldn't come to the masjid anymore. He didn't blame her. Versus in our community, women are the ones who are frequently punished when there is a mistake that happens. There wasn't a wall built. There weren't, timings that she was only allowed and he wasn't allowed. The other men, quite the opposite. SubhanAllah, there were women who would stay in the masjid, who would pray in the masjid, who would have, physical things that happen to women monthly. And then there were traces of being human in the masjid, of men and women. Policy wasn't created because of the fear of what might happen. Policies are created by what the Prophet ﷺ has created as policy, what Allah SWT has given us as guidelines, and in our different societies and communities, those are applied in different ways based on the guidelines that we have in that culture of that community. But what's important for us to recognize in terms of navigating this space is that just because someone is afraid that something might happen, that one person can't create a policy that's going to affect more than half of the entire masjid. And it's important for me as a woman to recognize that when I hear things that hurt my iman, that cause me to question whether or not Islam is the truth, that's not all of Islam. That's one person presenting one thing. And it's important for me to recognize that's not necessarily my religion. That might be one opinion. It's important for me to study. It's important for me to be mentored and recognize that all of the things that have come addressing women have only been to empower us, never to oppress us.
mean, when it comes to navigating allyship, I think, we were just talking about how these words relate to our faith, that should we use them or not. And I think it's interesting because the concept of allyship was perfectly encapsulated in the ayah that I mentioned in the beginning, awliya ba'd. This is the idea of being allies to each other, being guardians of each other's rights. And it really goes back to the concept of justice. When brothers and sisters, it is not specific to women. It's not specific to any one group. It's about justice. It's about being told and ordered to stand on the side of justice, bear witness to justice, even if it's against yourself, even if it's against your kin, whether it's against rich or poor. And interestingly, in that same ayah, we are warned that if we swerve toward bias, or if we turn away, or if we stand on the sidelines, then God is knowledgeable of everything we do. When it comes to women and their place and their rights and their access, it comes down to a question of justice. And when you're on the side of justice, it means it doesn't matter who this issue is about. And you have to have the courage, when it comes to this idea of allyship, the courage to withstand what might be criticism from your peers. When I talk to even shuyukh, sometimes they will hold an opinion in private that they don't want to say in public. And when I ask them why, they'll actually say because there would just be too much of a backlash from their peers. So there is a fear sometimes to stand in an unpopular place, standing for justice on behalf of any marginalized group, any group that might not be popular, any position that you might be getting heat for simply because of peer pressure. So it does take courage to actually be a true ally. And then finally, I think the most important thing about being an ally of any kind, standing in solidarity with any group, of this idea of being awliya ba'd, is that you don't replace the person you're trying to be a wali for. You actually empower and give them a space to have their own voice. In so many situations, so-called allies can actually disempower the people they're trying to supposedly support by speaking for them. The meaning of a wali is someone who listens to the person they're representing. They are actually guardians of their rights. They are not trying to substitute them and speak for them. I've been, interestingly, I've been on conference calls where I'm trying to get my point across, and some of my male colleagues, well-intentioned, are sort of speaking over me in an attempt to explain what I'm trying to say, even though I'm right there, and they're actually misrepresenting what I'm saying. But this idea of allies listen more than they speak, and they don't marginalize or silence, they actually amplify and support.
So we're talking about what male allyship means and what it looks like and its importance. To Sheikh Jamal, how do you navigate being a male ally in female empowerment? And what advice do you give to young Muslim men?
No pressure. So I actually haven't thought through these very much because my initial intention was to not speak on the panel. And then my wife didn't feel up to it this morning, so she made me go. And so I didn't really think about it because I got the email and I was like, all right, I'm not going to answer them anyways. They'll handle it and I'm going to be fine and like it's all good. So now I'm stuck. So I'm not speaking on behalf of all men, nor all white men, or all Pakistani men, or anyone else. So I think, like I said, for me the starting point is always Islam. And I think that one of the biggest challenges we have on either side, on the male side or the female side, is to get our relationship with Allah right. And why I say that is because a huge part of getting our relationship with Allah right is about it not being about us. And this is a central part of Islam that people don't really want to accept today. That a central tenet of Islam is that we are supposed to go against our ego. And it's not supposed to be about me. It's about a greater cause, it's about bigger issues, it's about other people, it's about humbling myself so that we can actualize what the Prophet ﷺ said, that مَنْ تَوَاضَعَ لِلَّهِ رَفَعَهُ اللَّهُ. And this is really an important secret, that the one who humbles himself for Allah, then Allah will elevate them. And so when we're talking about what is my advice to young men, I mean, my advice to young men is essentially that we just need to work on ourselves. And there's a lot of things in our society, in our culture, in the cultures that we come from that are not going to aid us in being whole with ourselves and our relationship with Allah. And there's no way that we can help anyone else or be allies to anyone else if we're not okay with ourselves. And that is really, I think, one of the biggest challenges. There are times when you will have to take positions that are not popular. Right now, that might be something like, I don't know, letting women pray downstairs. It was interesting when we were in the masjid. We never had an issue with women praying downstairs when I was in the masjid. Anytime an issue happened, there was always when I was outside. And I would come back and they'd be like, so-and-so came and they told me that I can't pray here or whatever. I'm like, does it ever happen when I'm there? Like, it doesn't. But that might be the issue that's at that particular time. But later on, it might be something else. And it might be on the other side. It might be not popular in public opinion. It might not. For example, like we do have still gender relations guidelines in Islam. People look at us like weirdos because we don't date before we get married, and we don't have relationships before we're married, and we speak to one another in very particular ways, and we don't touch one another, and all of these kind of things. People look at it like it's strange, but that's okay. Anyone else can look at it like it's strange, but with me and my relationship with Allah, that's the way that I do it. So I think really one of the core issues again is to ground ourselves in our relationship with Allah. That's largely a spiritual issue. It's also an intellectual issue. Sometimes a limited exposure to the intellectual history of Islam will make it difficult for us to ground ourselves, because we're perceiving that Islam is something that it's not, and then it becomes a fitna for us. But in any case, we have to really ground ourselves. If we ground ourselves in the example of the Prophet ﷺ, then that is the best grounding that we can possibly have. And that will give us the strength that we need in order to move forward. And that was always the issue for me. Right? People would say this or that or whatever. I said, look, I don't care. As far as I understand from Islam, there's certain conditions for my wife to be doing what she's doing. And as far as I understand, she's fulfilled them. So now it's on you, it's not on her. But there are conditions. Right? That's why I said it's not always popular. But there are conditions, and I felt that she felt that she met those conditions, and we were good with it, whatever. So I think that for me, that's the big point. What do I tell men? Is that we have to not be so fragile. And I don't mean that for men. It goes to both sides, right? Because if we're not grounded in our relationship with Allah, we're all fragile. We're all pushing and blowing in the wind wherever it's going to go. The only thing that keeps a person firm is that connection with Allah. So this is the most important thing. We ask Allah to give us strength, inshallah.
Jazakumullah. We're not potatoes so much. Jazakumullah khair. I wanted to open up an opportunity if there's any closing remarks that anyone wants to offer on this topic, briefly.
Okay, so forgive me, this is a shameless plug, but I do want to let you guys know, since we are on the topic of gender and gender relations, my sister, Maryam Mogahed, has her first dinner lecture event on what to look for when you're seeking a spouse. And it's January 22nd in Anaheim, California, and you can go on her website, Maryam Mogahed, everyone should probably know that, and find out more information on how to buy tickets. So if you are in Southern California, I highly recommend taking part in this. I think it'll be really important, really interesting on what to look for and how to avoid common pitfalls when you are seeking a spouse.
Yes, I would say that it took me 7 years to go from somebody who felt like I was so excited about Allah to somebody who was terrified of myself because of my personality as a Muslim woman, to go to somebody who recognized that Islam is vast in its scholarship, is perfect in the guidelines that it gives, and despite the struggles that we face in America right now, there are people who have gone through so much worse over and over and over. And I just want to say that I draw strength from people like you when I see that you're actually praying on campus in America, when people are constantly talking about you and making it seem like you're someone of fear. Yeah, you still pray? Yeah, you still we have struggles, the incredible Dalia, may Allah bless her, she talks about how this isn't specific to our community. We're not alone in the struggles we've gone through, but we have something very unique, and that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us He's with us wherever we are through His knowledge. So whenever we're struggling I'm looking at this text and it says something crazy crazy is not the right word. I feel like I'm misunderstanding what this hadith is saying. I didn't even say crazy. Or when someone is saying something about women or men and it just doesn't rub the right way, I just want to emphasize, don't take that to mean this is what Islam is saying. Sometimes it takes studying to understand that things that seem demeaning are actually so empowering. And so I would encourage all of us, a book to read is Al-Muhaddithat. Dr. Akram Nadwi, he wrote an encyclopedia of over 9,000 female hadith scholars in her history. And there's an introduction to English called Al-Muhaddithat. Al-Muhaddithat. It's by Dr. Muhammad Akram Nadwi, N-A-D-W-I. Look that up. The second thing is, I would recommend that all of us fortify our relationship with God through a relationship with the Quran. Read it in the translation. Read one verse a day. Right now, you might be like, oh, one verse a day, that's nothing. 365 days from now, that's a lot of verses that you've read. And inshallah, it'll be a means of protecting us and giving us strength in these times when we feel turbulent and like we need help. And the third thing is, find really good friends. And inshallah, with those great friends, inshallah, you'll be able to feel like you can get through some of the harder days. And may Allah ta'ala protect us and help us and give us for that.
I would just say that this is obviously a big topic, and for most of and there's a number of big topics that are very important for us to discuss as a community. I would just encourage people to remember that these conversations and the practical consequences and improvement upon them are ongoing conversations, and they're not going to be solved overnight. And they need really sincere and genuine interactions between all parties involved. And so part of that is making sure, like Ustad Maryam mentioned, to have good friends and to have good company and people you can look up to. It doesn't always have to be a sheikh or something like that, but it's important to have people who are serious about Allah in our lives, who we can look up to, and we can feel like they are a good example of a healthy relationship with God, but they're serious about God. And those people are invaluable in our lives, especially as we're trying to navigate and move past and improve upon any number of the challenges that we're facing. So that's all.
Jazakallah khair to our panelists for beginning the conversation, inshallah. Not finishing it, beginning it. So, I guess I'm going to make a few announcements for what's coming up. So, according to your program booklets, and we are on schedule, lunch is right now. If you have the event-based app on your phone, it has the schedule in there. It also gives you your dining options, since most folks will be wanting to go off campus, inshallah. Lost and Found is outside. So if you have lost something, or if you find something, please return it to the Lost